Hello and welcome to episode 41 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And in a previous episode, I happened to mention that throughout most of my life, my consciousness expands and contracts like the Buddhist cosmos, except at a much higher rate and maybe less predictably. And I just got to say that lately, the last few days especially, my consciousness has been pretty well contracted. It has been a rough week. But the show must go on, and I've got lots of questions. In fact, I thought that I was going to have a smaller number than usual of questions, and then I started compiling them, and it turned out to be about the usual number, like up around 30, 35. And then, like the last 24 hours, I got this onslaught of more questions. So this is going to be kind of a long one, I think. And bear with me if I'm not like frolicking in my seat and so forth, like I sometimes do. I didn't even bring anything weird to drink this time. So I'll just start answering questions. And the first one is from Mary, spelled Merry. And Mary says, have you ever seen the movie Fight Club? Do you think this movie illustrates some of the Buddhist teachings? I specifically want to guess your opinion. I think maybe he means test your opinion on the burning hand scene. Well, I have seen the movie Fight Club. In fact, it's one of my favorite movies. It's probably in my top 10, not my top 3, but my top 10 favorite movies. And it's definitely a guy movie. It's like the opposite of a chick flick. There are some women that like it, but then there's some guys who like chick flicks too. Um, See, do you think this movie illustrates some of the Buddhist teachings and specifically wants to guess or test my opinion on the burning hand scene? Well, the burning hand scene, I'm pretty sure, is where they put, what is it, lye or quicklime? No, it's lye for making soap on the back of his hand and then holds it, and he's got to like accept the agony before he can, before Tyler Durden will alleviate the pain for him. He's not allowed to go to his spirit cave and do visualization or anything. He's got to be right there with the pain, just experiencing it fully and accepting it. And this and some other things in Fight Club, just like, they weren't allowed to have names, which you could be considered, supporting the no self idea. Um, there's death, which supports, impermanence and the inevitability of death and that kind of a thing. But I mean, you could say that's in lots of movies. Just about every movie has at least some element of dharma or dhamma in it. So I don't think that the author of Fight Club, either the book or the writer of the screenplay, had Buddhism specifically in mind. It's just that there are some virtues, I guess, masculine virtues that are promoted in Theravada Buddhism that also happen to be promoted elsewhere. Um, so just because a movie is like promoting masculine virtues doesn't mean that it's necessarily a Buddhist movie. So I think it's probably incidental, like coincidental, that Fight Club, which is a good movie, that it does happen to overlap with some Buddhist teachings. So I'll just move on to Mary's next question. And Mary says, I can masturbate without absolutely no physical effort. I mean, no hand, no anything, just with the power of thought. I have read the commentary to the specific rule in the Patimokkha, and according to it, it is not sanghadisesa if you put no physical effort. So if I was a monk, is it true? Well, I don't think so. I think it means any kind of effort. It doesn't have to be physical effort. For example, um, to have an orgasm on purpose is the sanghadisesa rule in question here. And it is against the rules, very much against the rules for a monk to have an orgasm on purpose. The deliberate emission of semen is sanghadisesa number 1, requiring 6 days and 6 nights of penance and like a long pain in the neck reinstatement ceremony and so forth. And because it's an important rule, there's a lot of details on exactly what entails breaking the rule. And if a monk is making any kind of effort to have an orgasm, then that's already against the rule. For example, there's a case of it's not against the rule if you have like a wet dream, like you have an orgasm in your sleep. But if, let's say, you notice that you're more likely to have a wet dream if you sleep extra, you sleep a few extra hours, you get into the dreamy state and you're more likely to have wet dreams, and then you go to sleep deliberately in order to increase your odds of having a wet dream, and then you have it, you're guilty of breaking the rule because you have made an effort. So I mean, it wasn't really much physical effort, you weren't touching yourself or anything, but still it is an effort. So using your mind to do it is, I'm pretty sure that's against the rules also. And just to avoid going into a long, detailed talk on what does and does not entail Sangha number one, and considering the large number of questions this show, I think I'll just move on to Mary's next question. And Mary says, as I remember, humble stature, and then in parentheses he says, why I always thought he was humble statue, on parenthesis, wanted to come to South Carolina and maybe start something with you, a meditation group or a cult. I don't remember anything in that department, or it has just died of natural causes. Yeah, it is true that humble stature, which is not his real name, he started a group which I was invited to join, and I joined. I was game. It was called The Spiritual Right. And we got a website sort of going, at least the beginnings of it going. And we had some videos put out. We had like a YouTube channel and everything. And then he actually did move to South Carolina. He's here in town. But there were a few obstacles that were not overcome. One is he just could not make up his mind. He kept changing his plans, which started alienating members of the group. And he eventually just kind of decided against the whole thing, I guess. I mean, that was the last I heard. And so that was one thing. Also, my girlfriend and he didn't get along very well. He was kind of he'd go through phases of like just picking up chicks in bars, and my girlfriend didn't want me associating with such a person. So yeah, that kind of helped it to fizzle out, but it would have fizzled out anyway, I'm pretty sure, because he just kept changing his mind, and really couldn't just settle on a course of action and just stick to it. So maybe he should work on more aditana parami or something, more determination, just sticking to a plan. Let's do this even if we do it wrong, kind of an attitude. But he's doing fine. He's around. So I'll just move on to the next question by Mary, spelled Merry. Just a side note, what food, if any, can you keep indefinitely? Well, I assume this question is referring to Buddhist monastic discipline. What food, if any, can a monk keep indefinitely without breaking any rules? And if it's kept as food, then none. I mean, a monk is not allowed to store food more than one day if it's kept as food. But certain foods that have medicinal properties can be kept for as long as the monk wants, like salt, garlic, I think ginger. Um, there's some medicinal kind of like myrobalan fruits and that kind of a thing. Um, those can be kept indefinitely so long as they're not used for the monk to eat. Now, like if he's sprinkling the salt on his food to make it taste better, that's against the rules. But if he's using the salt medicinally, like maybe like using it as toothpaste to brush his teeth because he doesn't have access to toothpaste, something like that, then that would be okay. Or like a saline like a laxative or something. You can use salt water as a laxative. I guess the yogis do that. So that would be all right. So it would depend on the intention of the use. Like if it's used as food or to make food taste better, to improve the enjoyment of food, that kind of a thing, then no food can be kept more than 1 day. Um, but as I say, there is a list of foods like garlic and salt, and there's a number of other ones. I think ginger, like I said, that they can be kept indefinitely so long as it's purely for medicinal use. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And this one is in response to the video I did with Brian Rue on channeling. And Fred says, what's your thoughts on containers for spirits, e.g. tree spirit houses? Yeah, or like temples or churches are supposedly the house of God, that kind of a thing. Um, it may be that some lesser kind of spirits, hardly better than a ghost, might inhabit some temple dedicated to its honor or a shrine or something. But for the most part, um, yeah, like a temple to Athena wouldn't have Athena. I mean, assuming even that Athena is a real deity, yeah, I don't think she'd be living there. Um, I think that spirits that aren't earthbound, and yeah, I mean, they're not living on this planet at all. I mean, they might happen to come to a temple dedicated to their honor or a shrine dedicated to their honor simply because people are like invoking them there. But for example, Jehovah, I don't think he really cares all that much about churches any more than any other place on this planet. So, I mean, for like some earthbound deity that's like relatively low level, possibly, but for the most part, I don't think it works that way. And he has the term he uses is containers for spirits, which is sort of like it reminds me of what's the Ghostbusters? They got like the cage thing, the electronic cage for catching spirits. Yeah, I don't think those haven't been invented yet. So I'll just move on to Fred's next question. Can we reduce negative sankharas? Yeah, we can reduce negative sankharas. For those of you who don't know what a sankhara is one of the vaguest terms in the Pali language. It can mean anything that has a beginning and an end, which means it can be anything other than like Nirvana itself. But here it's like mental states, especially volitional mental states, like Sankhara Khanda is one of the 5 khandas that compose a human being, or one of the 5 aggregates, as it's called. And Sankhara in this case means like volitional mental states, especially just will in general. Will. So can we reduce negative volitional mental states? Yeah, we can do that. There's all different ways of doing it. One is just living a moral, simple, peaceful life, and then your mind just becomes more peaceful, and then you're gonna have less negative thoughts, unless you're just chafing it, living such a peaceful life, you're just bored as hell, and then that can cause problems on its own. Just replacing negative sankharas, like you notice you're having negative thoughts about somebody, you can just replace that. Once you catch it, you can just start thinking about something else. Um, just following Dhamma in general will tend to reduce the number of negative sankharas. It might also reduce the number of positive ones, but that's kind of inevitable because there's always kind of a balance going. Positive and negative have to balance out in the long run. So we'll just move on to the next question. This is from Achala, I think it would be pronounced Acala. I'm not sure what language that is. Achala, maybe it's Pali, so it would be pronounced Achala. And Achala says, what is the reason behind massive people dying due to natural disasters like earthquakes? In the Anguttara Nikaya 870, there's a discourse on earthquakes where Buddha explains to Ananda 8 reasons behind earthquakes. Those reasons given in the suttas are positive, so why something positive should result in a negative natural disaster? Is there something like collective karma? Um, well, actually, I think that sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya is like an excerpt from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which is the sutta in the Digha Nikaya describing the Buddha's final days. And he tells Ananda also in that sutta that there are various causes for earthquakes. And number one is that according to ancient Indian cosmology, the earth is floating on water and the water is floating on air, so that disturbances in the air causes disturbances in the water on which the earth is floating, which then causes the earth to shake. So that's not a positive one. That was the only like mechanistic explanation, and all the rest are just like prodigies. Like when the Buddha announces he's going to die, it causes the earth to shake, and that's why the earth shook. And then the Buddha was telling Ananda the causes of earthquakes. Um, so yeah, that one is morally neutral. It's not really positive, and those are probably the ones that cause all the death. I don't think like a Buddha becoming enlightened is going to like destroy a city or some such. So that's part of the answer here. But I think the main gist here is like how can a million people or 10,000 people all have the same karma that causes their city to be destroyed by an earthquake. And I was in a medium-sized town, medium sized for Alaska anyway, when I was a baby, and our the town of Seward, Alaska, was pretty much wiped out by the big earthquake there. Um, it's I, and I mean this comes up a lot, and it is a good question. How, if we all have our individual karma and there is no group karma as Buddhism teaches, then how is it that you know large numbers of people, like the bubonic plague or something, can wipe out a third of the Earth's population, or earthquake can just devastate a city or an entire area, that kind of a thing. How does that happen? And one of the main explanations is like Orthodox monks is that although there is no individual karma or no group karma, I mean, it's like, I mean, it's sort of like the debate in evolution is, do groups of animals evolve, or is it just the individual? Um, is like natural selection happening on groups, I guess would be a better way of putting it. Um, according to Buddhism, it's entirely individual, but people with similar karma, with similar stuff coming to them, may be reborn into the same kind of area, the same culture. So I mean that would be a substitute for group karma. Like just the endemic violence of the Middle East since prehistoric times. It's probably one of the reasons why civilization is said to have arisen in the Middle East area, is because it was so violent that their people figured out that if they had lived behind walls, they'd be safer. But so that is one explanation. It's just that people have like the same sort of karma will tend to be reborn into the same kind of groups, so that where that the same kind of things will be happening to them. And also, um, I think it was Ajahn Punadamo explained it this way once, if I remember correctly. He was saying that we have so much karma that pretty much everybody has some shit hitting the fan karma, included in that. And then when the earthquake comes, it's just, you have the seismic shift or whatever. It just conveniently fits in with that one. We've lived an infinite number of lives, supposedly, according to the doctrine, or it's just innumerable, so that we made all kinds of karma, and it may be that pretty much everybody has some kind of shit hitting the fan karma that can be used up when the shit hits the fan in some area. So that's kind of like two or three answers coming from different directions to that question. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And Austin says, can you share your understanding of the concept of chakras? Do Western monastics take this belief seriously? I've heard that they are considered to be swirling centers of energy within the body, which seems quite unusual to me. Well, this isn't really a traditional Buddhist concept. It's more comes from Hindu yoga. where you've got 7 chakras, and they're kind of along the spine, like the kundalini. You know, as your kundalini rises, your chakras open. They go higher and higher. Ram Dass used to talk about chakras a lot, and literally it means wheel. You know, it's just like an energy wheel, or more like a energy ganglion or something. And Ram Dass said that the average person, they've only got 3 chakras going that aren't like dormant, or just, you know, maybe just little twinges. You know, the base chakra is just survival. That's like, you know, the base of the spine is, I mean, that's just, you know, food and, you know, just avoiding danger, staying warm, comfortable, that kind of a thing. Then above that is sex. And then above that, you get to the solar plexus, or the dantian, I think some of the yoga people call it, or Chinese medicine people. And that's like power or status. And then it just, that's as far as most people get, according to Ram Dass. The next one that you hear the most about is the heart chakra, which is compassion. That's where you're just starting to get to the point where you realize, you know, you look at another person, you realize there's just another me there. You know, it's just everyone is a different version of just me. And it goes higher up until the final chakra is like right at the crown of the head, and that's like the enlightenment one. That's even higher than the third eye chakra. So I mean, it's kind of like abhidhamma as far as I'm concerned. It's, I don't really think that a scientist would detect these chakras. Otherwise, modern medicine probably would have detected them already. So, I mean, they're not anything physical. I think it might just be a kind of gimmick, like a theory that works. You know, you've got the different levels of advancement in human personality, or just in conscious development, that you know, you just sort of symbolize them as chakras along the spine channel. Although, of course, practicing yogi, some advanced swami might say, nope, they're for real, and I've experienced them directly. But yeah, it's more of a Hindu concept, and Orthodox Theravada says essentially nothing about it. Although I guess there is a Western monk who lives in America somewhere, um, who teaches. He's like incorporated yoga and chakras and stuff into his meditation instructions. Um, Brian Rue knows about him. I don't remember his name. He's kind of an older American man, I think. So I think that it's kind of a gimmick. I'm skeptical of their actual existence, but it does kind of help people to wrap their head around concepts, and it may be useful. And if you want to symbolize like different stages in like mental development or spiritual development as, you know, energy centers going up the spine, I mean, if it helps, then that's fine. So I'll just move on to Austin's next question. And this one, I'm not sure if he intended this one for the Q&A, although it was included with some other ones. And it's, are you open to engaging in lively debate? I believe that participating in discussions with other faith systems would foster meaningful dialogue and ultimately aid in the dissemination and comprehension of Buddhist teachings. If this interests you, I'm sure the Modern Day Debate channel would be honored to have you as a guest. Yeah, I've considered that. I mean, we watched, my sweetheart and I watched some of those Modern Day debates. The two main debates going on, it seems like the two main themes are, one are theists versus atheists, and two is flat earthers versus round earthers. That you can have like a 4 hour long debate on that channel over whether the earth is flat or round, and then like a week or two later there'll be another one. They just, it's like an inexhaustible gold mine of just back and forth. They do have some pretty inept debaters. I think I would do well on that channel, I think. Um, but yeah, I'm open for debate. I mean, there's a few things I could debate well. I mean, I obviously I could debate Buddhism. I could debate the whole atheism issue fairly well, although that one's being done to death on the channel. Something like evolution, but I mean, they've got evolutionary biologists who go on the show, so they would probably be able to do it better than I do, unless they're just crappy debaters. well, there are things like religion or spirituality in general or meditation, things like that. I think I could hold my own against like the materialistic atheist fairly well. But I'm not sure. I mean, would I just like contact them and say, hey, I want to debate somebody and tell them who I am and what I specialize in, that kind of a thing? Yeah, maybe. Someone wants to sign me up. I won't mind. So I'll just move on to Austin's next question. And this one's a good one. This is an interesting one. I don't know if I'll be able to answer it very well, but it's a fairly good one. Can you present a logically sound argument for Buddhism? Or is the nature of Buddhism inherently and understandable because using words to, inherently not understandable because using words to conceptualize reality is unfeasible? Well, there are different aspects of Buddhism, and you could logically give logical sound arguments to various aspects of Buddhism. Certain aspects of Buddhism, yeah, I don't think they would really hold up to intense scrutiny but those are really not the essential ones. You know, like some of the mythology, some of the legends, a lot of Abhidhamma philosophy. I mean, if you're debating this, I think it'd be hard to really defend the position well against an intelligent skeptic who debates well. But just like some of the basic ideas of Buddhism, like just striving for Nibbana, where, I mean, you can put that in terms of like Immanuel Kant in Western philosophy, who said that there are two truths, essentially, just like Buddhism teaches that there are two truths. You've got ultimate truth and you've got like conventional truth, or what Kant called the thing in itself and the thing as it seems, or just the phenomenon and the noumenon, something like that. And Kant said that you just cannot know reality. All you can know is just your mental, just the symbols cooked up by your mind in accordance with these categories and so forth. But in Buddhism, I think that Buddhism originally was a kind of systematic technique for understanding ultimate reality. And there's one ultimate reality that we can know directly, and that is the ultimate reality of our own consciousness. So, Buddhism, I could argue that Buddhism began as a kind of systematic method for cultivating what could be called mysticism, or just knowing consciousness directly without the intermediary of symbolic perceptions. Another thing that's fairly logical is that in Buddhism they're teaching the liberation from suffering, and or how to liberate yourself from suffering. And the way you do that, if you could put forth a logical case that good and bad, positive and negative, have to balance out in the long run. And so what a monk is doing, he's just trying to go for just clear neutrality. So, I mean, that's fairly logical. You know, you avoid unpleasant things and you avoid pleasant ones also. That's kind of like the middle path. You know, the middle path is the path between seeking out pleasure and seeking out pain. You just kind of, you know, right down the middle. And then you're in a state of equanimity and clarity of mind. You're not all like liking this, disliking that, getting all distracted, pitting yourself against reality. And then it's easier to penetrate the illusion and experience ultimate reality directly that way also. Some parts are more difficult than others to give logically sound arguments for, but it seems to me like the basics are pretty sound. The first three of the Four Noble Truths, for example, are just pretty solid logic. But I think I'll just move on to the next question. This is also from Austin. And he says, as someone who subscribes to the core teachings of the Eightfold Path, non-self, and the Buddha's enlightenment, but holds a different perspective on certain legends and tales, should I still consider myself a Buddhist? Well, welcome to the club. I'm in the same club there, even when I was a monk, like a junior monk. Still, I think I would fit the description here of someone who subscribes to the core teachings of the Eightfold Path, non-self, and the Buddha's enlightenment, etc. Holds a different perspective on certain legends and tales. Yeah, like talking animal stories, or like I already mentioned, like the earth floating on water, which then floats on air, that kind of a thing. It's irrelevant really to what Dhamma is essentially about. It's like in ancient Indian culture. So I might not be an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist, and Austin might not be an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist, but um, I think we come a lot closer to the essence of Buddhism than some people who are considering themselves to be authorities on Buddhism or just devout Buddhists. So yeah, no worries there. Now I'll just move on to Austin's last question here. Did you become a happier person after you entered monkhood? And that's a good question too. Um, it's weird. It's kind of a trick question because when I was a junior monk, or let's just back up a little, before I became a monk, I was starting to worry. I was in my late 20s, kind of a rascal, and I was kind of worried that, I mean, if there is such a thing as hell, I might wind up going there. I wasn't really an evil person, but I was I wasn't particularly moral from a Buddhist point of view. And I just thought, well, if I become a monk, then I'll be joining the ranks of these men dedicated to enlightenment, and all of them will be wiser than me because they've been striving harder than me. And then I entered this Asian monastery, and you get this harsh awakening to the fact that most Asian monks, maybe most Western monks, but certainly most Asian monks aren't even trying really. They might be like a Buddhist layperson who's just trying to get enough merit to get a better rebirth, but they're not striving for enlightenment. They're not really doing much to cultivate wisdom. A lot of them don't bother to meditate or follow the rules. They're just like priests that do the ceremonies and do the chanting and bless people. And they're like masters of ceremonies for the lay people that like the ceremonies. So I was like very disillusioned and sullen for quite a while. I remember I was trying to come up with one word to describe each person at the monastery, and the word I came up with for myself was sullen. But on the other hand, when you enter the monkhood, it's like life gets much simpler, more peaceful, and it might not be happier necessarily, but it's less unhappy because, as I was already saying, like happy and unhappy have to balance out. So from like a Buddhist point of view, the truest happiness is just kind of a neutrality, just equanimity. And yeah, I had more of that. I had more clarity, at least in phases. But there were times as a monk. I mean, it's you're just like hitting a wall. You're just in a state of despair and desperation. I mean, that happened a lot too. I was talking at the very beginning about how my consciousness expands and contracts, and probably the worst I was ever depressed in my life was as a monk living in a big school monastery near Mandalay. I mean, that was awful. I was almost incapacitated. Just I was just so contracted down and just dry and dry of spirit. So yeah, I think a monk who is good at being a monk and being a monk fits him, he will be more content, more serene. And that was generally my situation um, most of the time, especially after I started, going off and living in the forest alone, where I wasn't having to participate in sort of Asian traditional Buddhism so much and just go out in the woods and just chill. But I mean, even that, I mean, just celibacy can be a strain, or just being alone can be a strain. Not being able to stop sweating in tropical climates. I mean, things can just get to you. So yeah, I'm kind of skeptical as to the whole idea of being happier or unhappier overall, unless it's just more equanimous or less equanimous. And as a layperson, I've sort of adopted the whole Stoic idea of, You just have to accept the ups and the downs. You know, it's like you're making more karma. You're going to have more good and more bad happening to you, probably, just going with statistics or whatever. And so you just have to, like, try to surf the waves better. And so that's more happy and more unhappy, I guess, as a layperson. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Ethel Sieg, I think is how it's pronounced. Ethel Sieg, something like that. Aethelsiege, which sounds Old English. And Ethel Sieg's first question here, and this is another one that comes up. This is a tough question. I think I'm right in saying that memories are not part of the karmic momentum carried forward in rebirth, but some people, quite often children, seem to be able to recall details of past lives in quite some detail. Do you believe in past life memories? And if so, how is this explained in Buddhist philosophy? And why can't everyone remember their previous lives? Okay, there's a little bit to kind of deconstruct here, if you'll forgive me using that term. Um, Memories are not part of the karmic momentum. In a way, they are. I mean, just going with hardcore Abhidhamma, I've asked about this. Abhidhamma scholars, I've consulted Abhidhamma scholars on this, and they say that every single thing that arises in your mind or your body, every like sensation or thought that arises is kama vipaka. It's the fruition of karma. So from that point of view, memory would have a karmic element, to say the least. Um, but as he says, I mean, we don't remember our past lives, and that's, I mean, just going with, I mean, one answer I've given to that. One person asked me why don't we remember our past lives, is because we got a different brain, but that's really not a good Buddhist answer. I have read a couple books by Ian Stevenson about children who remember past lives. And my father also claimed to remember some of his past lives. Um, he remembered just details of at least 4 or 5 past lives. And in his case, he remembered them through hypnotic regression. It wasn't through meditation or going into deep meditative states, unless being in a deep hypnotic trance could be considered something similar. The children, I mean, in the books, the children who remembered details of their past lives were often just, I mean, they got it right. They seem to remember it quite clearly, some of it. And then as they get older, they would just stop identifying with that life and just start identifying more with the body that they were in. So I guess some children, when they're first born, they still have, they're not really fully identified with the new life yet. And so they're still getting a lot of bleed through from the previous one. I do think that it's possible. I don't think that everyone who claims to remember past lives is necessarily remembering past lives. I mean, in a hypnotic trance, you're told that you're going to remember past lives. You'll just cook something up, just that you would expect, And a lot of people who presumably know their past lives, they're all like famous and that kind of a thing. Yeah, why can't everyone remember their past lives? I think it's just a matter of forgetting. So let's see here. Yeah, I'll just move on to the next question. That is a tough question though. And this is Ethel Sieg's second and last question here. What's the correct or the best way of doing walking meditation? I've seen videos where people are doing it really, really slowly, whereas others seem to be walking quite quickly. And when you're doing walking meditation, what specifically should one be mindful of? Well, there's different ways of doing walking meditation, just as there's different ways of doing sitting meditation. Like the Mahasi method, you're going in slow motion, and usually for beginners, you're just being mindful of the lifting of the foot and the putting down of the foot, or the lifting of the foot and then the moving forwards of the foot and the putting down of the foot, and the lifting of the other foot and the moving forwards and the putting down. And An even simpler way than that is just counting steps. You know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then back to 5. And I mean, there's just different ways of doing it. Um, the way I have done it when I was doing walking meditation is, I mean, you're just mindful of whatever sensation is the most obvious. For me, it was generally like my feet touching the ground, or a lot of the time there'd be like this oily, slippery sensation in my knee joints when my legs would swing. That for some reason it was easy for me to just rest my my mindful concentration on that. So whatever is most obvious, like if you got your eyes open, it's pretty much have to do when you're doing walking meditation, even seeing, you know, just sometimes at night in Burma, I do walking meditation, just looking straight forwards and just not focusing your, you know, not like focusing on anything in particular. You just have like the wide open gaze of like a camera or something, or a mirror, and just do it that way. Just use the seeing mindfulness of seeing. Although, since you're walking, usually one of the most um, noticeable things to attend to is just the whatever's going on in your legs and your feet. You know, whatever sensations are most noticeable there, and then you can do it. You know, all the time. It's not just walking back and forth in a special, you know, special covered walkway. I mean, you can be going up and down stairs or just walking at work or whatever, and you can be doing walking meditation so long as you're being mindful of the process or of anything really, is even seeing. I mean, you don't even have to be uh, mindful of the legs moving, although you want to take in as much as you can. You know, you want it as wide of a scope as possible without necessarily focusing on one thing in particular. But I think I'll get back to that a little bit with regard to sitting meditation. But I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Johannes. I believe that is how to pronounce his name, Johannes. And Johannes says, in the Anapanasati Sutta, the main foundation is the knowing of long and short in and out breaths. Is there any chance that Digam Asasami and Rasam Asasami, or I breathe in long and I breathe in short, in the English translation of the Pali words, can be translated as abdominal breathing and thoracic breathing? It always baffled me that short and long in this case should refer to a temporal aspect of the in and out breathing. It seems in the context of the Anapanasati Sutta that the two terms are way more defined than just temporal length or shortness, since there is no way to say that an in-breath is absolutely long or short time-wise. It's very vague to assume that this is meant. No, I've never, no, it's the part of the question there is no, question mark. It's not like I'm saying no to that. I continue. I never got how the knowledge about the temporal length of an in-breath should develop mindfulness on the whole body, sabakaya pati samvedi in Pali, when the normal instructions for developing mindfulness on the body are to develop mindfulness on the spatial movements and positions of the body. Well, I don't think that breathing in long means abdominal breathing and breathing in short means thoracic breathing, but it could just mean like, I mean, I've noticed this too. I don't think it was very the best way of instructing on mindfulness. It's just like, you know, the quality of the breath. You know if you're breathing deep or if you're breathing shallow, taking long slow breaths or short fast breaths. I think that's the point of it, is you're watching the breathing, and you're knowing what you're doing in your breathing. You know if you're breathing, shallow. You know if you're breathing deep. You know if you're breathing, quickly or slowly. That kind of a thing. I think that's the main point of it. But yeah, I do not see that it's referring to abdominal or thoracic breaths. But really, I mean, if when I'm doing breathing meditation, I mean, you're mainly just watching the sensation of touch at the nostrils, or at least that's the way I would do it. And look, except for when I was at a Mahasi Center and they make you do the belly stuff. So yeah, it's just too much thinking. Like if you're dividing it up into I am breathing long or I am breathing short and just like that, that it's just way too much thinking, and it kind of it lowers the quality of the meditation. So you just be aware of it. I mean, just watch it, and that's good enough. So the next question from Johannes is, do you have any experience with working out while living a Dhamma life? In the Bhikkhu Vibhanga, in the story about Daba, the 7-year-old arahant, it is said that there were some monks engaging too much in physical exercise. I don't know the Pali original, but I was wondering if maybe you knew some Pali texts discussing the topic and if you have some experience with it. Well, physical exercise is not encouraged in the rules of monastic discipline. Um, just for health, like for health, just walking a lot is the usual exercise that a monk gets. That and just the standard, chop wood, carry water kind of stuff. Just living the life of a forest monk generally involves enough exercise to keep you healthy, and that's the whole point. Is you're supposed to be healthy for the sake of practicing Dhamma. Um, Trying to beautify yourself, trying to be buff or ripped or whatever the term is, yeah, that's definitely out. No kind of beautification. You're not even supposed to eat food for the sake of beautification. You're not supposed to do anything for the sake of beautification of your body. Um, so yeah, doing like calisthenics or even something like Tai Chi could be borderline because that's kind of meditative. You could sort of do that as a meditation, but like swimming for exercise, um, yeah, working, lifting weights and stuff, yeah, that would be out, I'm pretty sure, unless it was like you have a doctor telling you that, I mean, you got to do these exercises, like stretches or something. Maybe you've got like plantar fasciitis in your foot or something. You got some kind of tendon problem or something, and you need to do stretches and some kind of exercises to repair that or fix that, then that would be okay. But yeah, just like the modern or modern Western or even like the classical Greek love for gymnastics and exercise and that kind of a thing, it's pretty much alien to Theravada Buddhist monasticism. I mean, you just have to be just healthy enough to practice, and that's good enough. So I'll just move on to Johannes's next question. And that is, did the Buddha practice the Noble Eightfold Path? If yes, when did he exactly start to practice it? If no, is it really so absurd to assume that there are two ways to enlightenment? Well, this is kind of a trickier question than I thought because um, apparently, I mean, he wasn't practicing the Noble Eightfold Path perfectly up until just very shortly before he became enlightened because he was doing the austerities, just like torturing himself, which was not, like right conduct. Um, but yeah, I mean, he practiced the Noble Eightfold Path, I assume. I mean, just assuming that the whole Noble Eightfold Path is not an anachronism. There is some evidence that the eightfold nature of the path, not the idea of the path itself, not Magga Sacha itself, but dividing it up into 8 factors, that could be a later development. Not very much later, but still later. Like there are some there's at least a few suttas teaching a tenfold path. Um, I think right liberation is one of the extra ones. But let's see. If no, is it really so absurd to assume that there are two ways to enlightenment? Well, he had a lot of parami. He was practicing, all the right things at different times, probably, and got better and better at it. So he was very close. It may be that you just cannot practice the Noble Eightfold Path perfectly until you are perfect. If you're fully enlightened, then you're able to practice it perfectly. But you do the best you can, and that's kind of what the path is about. It's not just standing one place. There's a certain process to it, and you tend to get better and better at it. So, but again, like the whole eightfold nature of the path may be a later addition. So I'll just, man, it's like, I feel like there's probably more I should say about this, but I can't think of what it would be. Did the Buddha practice the Noble Eightfold Path? If yes, when did he exactly start to practice it? If no, is it really so absurd to assume that there are two ways to enlightenment? Um, yeah, well, it's sort of like Angulimala is a good example, who was a serial killer. Angulimala literally means a garland of fingers because he would cut off a finger of each of his victims, and he was making this big necklace out of it. And he tried to kill the Buddha, and the Buddha converted him. And then um, I guess he started following the Eightfold Path after that, and he didn't do it for very long. He became enlightened after that. I mean, after he became a monk, you know, he got converted by the Buddha after trying to kill him. After trying to kill him, then he was ordained as a monk and practiced, and presumably he was following the Noble Eightfold Path before he became enlightened. So with the Buddha though, it's he was probably doing some of them really well, and then sort of going off the track a little bit with the self torture stuff for a while, and then he just kind of snapped back into place and got it all right and became enlightened. That is my guess. So I'll just move on to the next question from Ioannis. Does the Pali Canon specify that there is only one bodhisattva at a time? No, I don't think so. I think there's lots of bodhisattvas, which is weird because you'd think that there'd be a limited number. There are so many bodhisattvas or bodhisattas in Theravada Buddhism. It's just in Burma. A lot of, like the founder of the tradition in which I was ordained, Tom Pulusiato, he considered himself to be a bodhisattva. Um, So there's lots of bodhisattvas, and once you become a bodhisattva, then there's the zillion gajillion years of perfecting all of the paramis. So yeah, so there are lots. It's just that there's only going to be one next Buddha, and so that bodhisattva is supposedly in Tusita heaven, I think, supposedly waiting until it's his time to come down as Maitreya Buddha, or Maitreya in Sanskrit. But yeah, the easy answer to that question is no, there's not just one bodhisattva at a time. So, Ioannis' next question. Where does it say that paccekabuddhas only arise when the teaching of the Buddha is not in the world? If the Buddha said that his true teaching would be gone after 500 years, doesn't this mean that a lot of mystics from the different religions could be paccekabuddhas? I'm not exactly where it originally says, like the authoritative statement in the text that paccekabuddhas only arise when there is not a Buddha in the world. That could be a later development. Maybe the whole idea of paccekabuddhas could be a later development, but it is Orthodox tradition, and a lot of books that are composed later, 20th century books, will assert when discussing this that a paccekabuddha they only arise at times when there is no Buddhism. So it's not, yeah, it's when the Buddha Sasana is extinct in this world, then you've got these hermit Buddhas. Pacceka is like for oneself Buddhas. It's just kind of what Pacceka means. It's like for oneself. He's fully enlightened. He's better, he's higher up than just an ordinary arahant. He's got the omniscience of a Buddha and so forth. But he just opts to be a hermit and not teach. Like according to tradition, Gautama Buddha, our Buddha, almost became a Pacceka Buddha because he figured nobody would understand dependent co-arising. So, yeah, I don't know. That's the first question. I don't know where the oldest statement is that Pacceka Buddhas only arise when the teaching of the Buddha is not in the world. But then there's this next question here that's part of that question. If the Buddha said that his true teaching would be gone after 500 years, doesn't this mean that a lot of mystics from the different religions could be paccekabuddhas. Um, yeah, if you had fully enlightened beings after Buddhism has died out, and if you assume that Buddhism has died out, and what's passing for Buddhism now is like a forgery, that it's not authentic Buddhism, then it's possible, but they wouldn't be teaching. See, that's the thing. If you've got mystics from different religions that are promoting their system, then they wouldn't be paccekabuddhas because they're not hermits living out in a forest cave somewhere. But although Buddhism is wise enough that it doesn't insist that only Buddhists can go to heaven, any good person of just about any spiritual or religious system can go to heaven if they make enough merit, if they do more good than bad. But Theravada Buddhism still has claims pretty much of a monopoly on enlightenment. That although members of other religions can go to heaven, only a good Theravada Buddhism who practices correctly, only a good Theravada Buddhist who practices correctly can become fully enlightened and attain nirvana. Unless you're a paccekabuddha that is just like an outlier, almost like an anomaly. And then they're not, for some reason, they just don't teach. But I'm rather skeptical of the whole idea. I think Hindus can become enlightened. I would not be surprised if there had been more enlightened Hindus than enlightened Theravada Buddhists. There have probably been enlightened Mahayana Buddhists. I wouldn't be surprised if there's even been some enlightened Christians. St. John of the Cross would be a good candidate for that. Maybe Meister Eckhart. So yeah, so I'm just kind of skeptical of the whole idea of um, only a Buddhist can possibly become enlightened. So I'll just move on to Johannes's next and last question here. And that is, what is satipaññā? Is it comparable to Buddha nature? Well, satipaññā literally is mindfulness and wisdom, or at least going with the usual translations of sati and paññā. It's memory, understanding, or something. Yeah, it's essentially like the wisdom of mindfulness, essentially. And is it comparable to Buddha nature? That's a tough one. Buddha nature itself is a Mahayana term, and it seems to me that Buddha nature is just like an awareness of the absolute. Deep down, you still have this awareness of the absolute, and that's your Buddha nature. And then, of course, one of the most well-known Zen koans is, a monk asked Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature? And Joshu said mu, which in Chinese, the original Chinese would be wu, which, I mean, maybe he was just barking like a dog instead of saying no, because wu meant no. But I mean, he wasn't saying that a dog doesn't have Buddha nature. He was just sort of saying, don't even go there. But that's not the question here. Yeah, I mean, there could be some overlap, I suppose, if you consider the Buddha nature just to be like the deep down awareness of the absolute, of the highest truth, that um that you should really cherish, you should cultivate that. And satipaññā may be a way of cultivating it, but I don't think it's exactly the same. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Andreas. And this question comes up every few episodes here, in some form or another. Andreas says, what are your thoughts on semen retention, brahmacharya, or celibacy? I recently noticed huge benefits, but after some time, those turn into the opposite, like lethargy and obsessive thoughts and desires. Any tips on overcoming those downsides? So, yeah, I think I'd be more inclined to address celibacy than semen retention because if you're young and still got a lot of vitality, then you're still not going to be retaining your semen because, at least in my case, I was averaging like a wet dream every couple weeks. I think my record was 3 in 3 nights. So, I mean, it's still I mean, if you build up too much pressure, it's going to have to give. But celibacy, it does have its benefits. Some of them are just kind of superficial outward benefits of, like, you're not involved in a relationship that can have such ups and downs and distractions and pleasures and displeasures and all of it. You just kind of get lost in samsara that way. I think that's one of the main benefits of celibacy is um, it just kind of helps you to avoid the extremes, and it's more of a middle path kind of approach. But I mean, it's not for everybody. It's even the New Testament, like in Jesus of Nazareth in the New Testament, says there are three kinds of eunuchs in this world. There's those that are born eunuchs, those who are made eunuchs, and those who are eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And that's people who are celibate for spiritual reasons. And then he says, but it's not for everybody. And it's not, because I mean, some people are just, they're just horny and frustrated all the time. I can relate to that. So, with regard to making celibacy easier, two of the traditional Buddhist ways are just don't eat very much and don't sleep very much. And when you're like malnourished and sleepy, you're less likely to be horny. Um, Yeah, I mean, you want to kind of keep the life force kind of burning low if you're celibate. Like in Hinduism, I mean, you wouldn't want to be eating a lot of rajasic foods, eating lots of meat and spicy foods that tend to up the libido kind of a thing. Soy, maybe. I don't know. I shouldn't encourage that. Um, yeah. So just, I mean, if you're living a clean life, then you just try both ways and see which way works better, I guess. Or just anything is going to have downsides. I mean, the last part here, any tips on overcoming these downsides, aside from just, eating less and sleeping less so that your fire is burning lower and less likely to, erupt in a volcano. Um, yeah, to some degree, it's just mindfulness. It's like you just observe the the negative effects or whatever, or just observe what's going on and just endure it with equanimity if possible. Okay, but I will say that just like visualizing rotting female corpses and that sort of thing it doesn't work. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Rui, and Rui says, oh, this is a good question too, by the way. Rui says, salutations, Panyo. Were you practicing a specific meditation during that period that you call my best meditation? So, I guess, yeah, yeah, I was practicing a specific meditation, I suppose. I called it fourth gear. Um, when I was doing intensive practice, I had four gears that were worked out just through trial and error, what worked and what didn't work and so forth. First gear was just like desperation mode where, it's like your mind is just so all over the place and distracted and restless that you can't really get into any deep meditation. My primary object would be the pressure of my two thumbs pressing together in my lap, which is kind of a good primary object because you can adjust it. If it's the pressure is getting too much, then you can just lighten up. And if the pressure is not enough to notice easily, you just push your thumbs together a little harder. And then aside from that, I would label everything except for breathing, uh, breathing, hearing, and swallowing my own slobber. I think those are the three things that I wouldn't have to know. I mean, you have to like be aware of it, but you wouldn't label it. You just label everything else, like itching or wondering about something, what was that sound? Just wondering, remembering, you know, pain, stretching, pressure, just anything else that arose as a distraction from the primary object. And the primary object would just be touching, just touching, touching, touching. That was first gear. Second gear was anapana, where you're just observing the the sensation of touch at or around the nostrils. And I wouldn't be labeling it, but I would label anything else except for hearing and swallowing my slobber. And then a third gear was like you're pretending like your mind is hooked up to a loudspeaker and you're like in a library or something with this big scary librarian lady. And every time you start thinking, it's blasted over the loudspeaker, and the big scary librarian lady starts giving you dirty looks, and you're going to get in trouble. So you're just trying to keep your mind quiet. You're just observing your mind very carefully. And then if a thought starts to arise, you just try and stop it. That would be third gear. And then fourth gear is it's almost effortless. It's like you get into this state where you're just wide open. Your mind is just clear. And I don't know if you could say it was empty or not, but it's like just clear like glass. And you're very mindful at the time, so that if a thought starts to arise, it's sort of like a fish starting to arise to the surface of a pond. You start seeing the ripples before the fish even gets all the way to the top. And then you just immediately become aware of that, and then it just flattens back out to a flat calm again. And that was the kind of meditation that I was doing, where you're just sitting there essentially empty, just your mind is just silent and clear like glass. So that was, I was able to do that on a daily basis for months when I was had the best meditation in my life. At least for a while. I mean, it wouldn't be all day long, but I was able to get to that level fairly well, um, for a considerable period of time every day for months, although I never fully mastered it. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from Conrad. This is sort of a multi-part question about precepts. And Conrad says, Panyo Basa, I have a question about the Buddhist precepts. I watched one of your videos from a while ago where you explained how a lot of the things we regard as Buddha's essential teachings were were actually inserted in later. So firstly, did the Buddha actually invent the 5 precepts for lay people, or are they a later addition? Well, actually, it's neither, because the 5 precepts in some form or another existed before the time of the Buddha. He just adopted it as just sort of the standard for the supporters of a monastic group. Like the Jains had their own version of the 5 precepts. Only the fifth precept differed, and I think the supporters of like the forest dwelling Brahmins, the proto Hindus, they also had 5 precepts. And so it was just like Indian tradition that the monks would have, an elaborate set of precepts, but that the lay people who supported the monks would only have 5, or, I mean, a minimum of 5. They could take extra ones as optional. So I think with the Jains, it was the 5th precept was like owning private property or something. They apparently were rather communistic, but in Buddhism, it's mainly taking intoxicants which cause heedlessness or cloudedness of mind. So yeah, it was just sort of a modification of an already existing system, the 5 precepts. So that goes probably way back. So I'll just move on to Conrad's next question on precepts here. On the first precept, is it ever justified to take life without it being bad karma? For example, in self-defense, or premeditated taking of life for just purposes such as nourishing oneself by fishing, or the state executing of a murderer as a method of retribution for his deed. The only way that you take life without it being bad karma, as a general rule, there may be weird exceptions, but as a general rule, the only way to kill a living being without making bad karma is if you do it completely undeliberately. You're not doing it on purpose. You have no intention to kill the thing, but you just step on an ant while you're walking, something like that. Self-defense, it's still considered to be bad karma. I mean, if you're lashing out in which even a monk is allowed to strike out in self-defense, and you accidentally kill the guy, then maybe you haven't made bad karma for killing him. If you're just trying to get away or just trying to fend off his blows, and you wind up accidentally, dealing a mortal blow to him yourself. But like hunting and fishing, no. Even self-defense. If you're like a pure enlightened sage, supposedly, according to Theravada Buddhism, you just let yourself get killed. If you couldn't run away, I mean, you wouldn't fight back. You turn the other cheek, and or no, you wouldn't even do that. You just let yourself get killed. And executing murderers, no, there's even a little story in the text with regard to the murder. Like that's parajika number 2, right? No, parajika number 3. The third parajika. If you commit murder, you're excommunicated for life. You're no longer a monk. You can never be ordained again. And there was one monk who was advising the state executioner that he should keep his axe sharpened and try to finish off the victim with one blow. And the monk was just trying to be compassionate. He didn't want the murderer, even though he was a murderer, or somebody worthy of the death penalty, found worthy of the death penalty. He didn't want him to have like this gnarly death where it takes like 5 or 6 chops to get his head off. So he was just being compassionate. Just keep the axe well sharpened, try and finish it with one blow. And oh, just a second. I just had an alert saying the battery on this computer is almost dead because I forgot to plug it in. Okay, we're good. So anyway, he was when the executioner followed his advice, that monk was an accessory to murder. He was guilty of the parajika offense. Just even though he was motivated more by compassion, still, I mean, if you deliberately take a life, then yeah, you're still getting the karma for it. But I mean, the karma varies. I mean, if you're trying to kill someone compassion, you're trying to kill not someone necessarily, even an animal. You're trying to do it humanely. Like you're hunting and you just shoot it right through the head with one shot and that's it. I mean, that's going to be better than bow hunting and just letting it bleed out while you're tracking it for 3 days, that kind of a thing. So I mean, there are levels of badness of killing, deliberate killing, but there's always at least a little bit of badness involved, so that a saint just wouldn't kill anything, supposedly, according to the texts. Like there was one story in the Visuddhimagga about some arahant, or maybe he wasn't even an arahant yet. He was this monk who lived in the forest, and he got tied up with living vines by some robbers who stole what little he had, and then just left him there. And then they like tipped over a oil lamp or something and caught the forest on fire. And so the forest is burning, but he won't break the vines because they're still alive. They're still living plants. And he let himself just burn to death. And I think he became enlightened while he was burning to death. That's how extreme Buddhist ethics are. Only just a monastic saint or sage can really be fully moral. There's almost everything we do has got at least a little bit of bad karma mixed in with it. So I'll just move on to Conrad's next question. Is it ever justifiable to break any of the other 4 precepts under certain circumstances? Stealing, false speech, sensual misconduct, intoxication. If you do it on purpose, there's always going to be a certain amount of demerit involved, or bad karma, akusala kama. But I mean, there may be cases in which it may be justified to you. You may think that breaking the rule is less immoral than keeping the rule. For example, I've told this story before. There's a famous story called The Fourth Wise Man. I can't remember the author. It's a famous short story about he's this wise man in Persia. He sees the Star of Bethlehem, so he's going to go with the other magi to go and worship the baby Jesus following the star. But he's got some kind of complications. He's going to meet up with them. They go on ahead, and he just keeps getting sidetracked because he's like having to help people, and he's like giving away the treasure that he was going to give to the baby Jesus because they need it so bad. So anyway, he gets to Jerusalem, and you got King Herod has ordered the death of all the baby boys, and he's just staying in this house where there's a woman with a baby boy, and she's just terrified. So he just he has compassion, says, "Don't worry," and he stands at the doorway. And when the soldiers of King Herod come pounding on the door, he gives a little bit of the treasure he was going to give to the baby Jesus. You know, it's like this big pearl or something. And he looks the soldier in the eye and says, "There's no babies here." And the soldier looks at this treasure that he's getting, and he just waves the soldiers on. He says, "There's no babies here. Let's keep going." So the guy lied, but of course the mother is on her knees, just crying in just joy and gratitude. You know, obviously, I you could argue he did better by telling the lie than letting the woman's baby get butchered. So I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities here, and you're gonna have to judge, you know, choose the lesser of two evils, because five precepts is just sort of a guideline. It's just purely superficial. Buddhist ethics are not with regard to bodily actions nearly so much as they are with regard to mental states. What determines the karmic value of an action is the mental states accompanying the action, you know, the volition or the will, and not just the physical action itself. Two people can do exactly the same physical action. One is doing good and the other one is doing bad, or one is doing more good than bad and the other one is doing vice versa. So there may be times when it may seem like the lesser of two evils, and that's a choice that you have to make individually. Although, as a general rule, you're still going to be making bad, at least a little bit of bad karma. Just pure good karma is pretty much of a myth. So Conrad's next question regarding precepts here. Furthermore, what is defined as sensual misconduct? I understand that being adulterous is immoral, but how about premarital sex with a committed partner? Is all sex between consenting adults who are not using deception or trickery or engaging in adultery regarded as moral? So one night stands are moral. Well, mainly sensual misconduct would be adultery. Um, like if you're married and you're messing around with somebody else, or you're messing around with somebody else who is married. Also, just promiscuous sex that's just for the sake of pleasure. That's out. So one night stands would not be moral. Hiring a prostitute would not be moral. And then there's like a list of like forbidden females, and it's any woman who's already under the patriarchy of a man, or the guardianship, you know, like the woman who already has a husband, you know, she's under the protection or the guardianship of her husband. A girl still living with her parents, regardless of how old she is. I mean, she's like already under the guardianship of a man. Like another guy's slave, a female prisoner, because she's like under the guardianship of the prison guards or whatever. So it's like the only woman that you can have sex with and have it be um, like not be sensual misconduct is, I mean, if she's not already spoken for, and if you generally love her, I mean, if you have genuine feelings for her. I mean, if you're married to her, then I guess theoretically you could have sex with her without loving her or something, maybe just for the sake of having babies or something. But um, yeah, it's mainly you don't have to be married. Like in Theravada Buddhism, like the ancient Ganges Valley was a little bit more advanced than some later cultures, and with regard to a lot of things. And yeah, it's you don't have, like, fornication is not necessarily immoral, unless it's just, you know, the one night stand is just like um, promiscuous sex. Promiscuous sex is not moral. But if it's with somebody that you're committed to, you know, you're together, you're committed to each other, then yeah, that's not necessarily immoral from a layperson's point of view. I mean, all sex. I mean, we'll get to that in this next question here. Also from Comrade, is homosexuality regarded as immoral? Um, Pretty much all sexuality is regarded as immoral to some degree, you know, because it's desire is the cause of all suffering, and sex involves desire and lust, and you know, lust is one of the three poisons, and uh, so yeah, homosexuality is regarded as immoral. Heterosexuality also is kind of seen as sort of like a necessary evil for lay people, or maybe a necessary pleasure for lay people. Um, but the whole concept of homosexuality, it it's arguable that it didn't really exist in ancient times. Um, like I've said more than once, like in ancient Rome, there was no real concept of homosexuality. It was you were masculine or effeminate, and that depended on whether you were on top or on bottom. But even a man like performing cunnilingus on a woman, that would be considered almost as bad because you had to be on top. You're the one who was receiving the pleasure, not the one who was giving it necessarily. I mean that's not an entirely precise way of putting it, but maybe you get the idea. And in like ancient India also, there's not much talk about homosexuality in the texts that I can remember. I mean, there's men consorting with pandikas who were like eunuchs who weren't considered to be fully male or fully female. They were sort of like an alternative to females at times or something. But as a general rule, people who are sexually deviating from straight heterosexuality were considered to be um, like more perverse in like morally perverse or more um, unrestrained in their desires. And there's modern evidence backing that up. Like I've read in a medical guide that it is not uncommon for a homosexual man to have had more than 1,000 sexual partners in his life. They're more unrestrained in that sense. At least a lot of them are. And so they got a reputation for um, just being sexually depraved in Theravada Buddhism, so that any man who wasn't just like a straight male heterosexual going with ancient Indian tradition, that he wasn't even allowed to be ordained as a monk. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. This is the last question from Conrad on precepts. And he says, furthermore, Paññāvāsa, do you believe that perhaps many Buddhists are dogmatically attached to the precepts and don't make room to be flexible? Surely it is the intention which determines the righteousness of a given action, so surely in the right mental states, one could theoretically break all precepts without it being necessarily bad karma. Well, I mean, there's always going to be at least a little bit of bad karma. Again, it's a matter of choosing the lesser of two evils. Like the standard example is the monk who just sits on a riverbank and watches a pretty girl drown because it's against the rules for him to be touching her by saving her. So, I mean, theoretically, you could say he's just remained morally neutral by just sitting there. He's not thinking anything. Maybe he's just meditating while she's out there floundering and splashing and going down for the third time. But yeah, I think a lot of monks would just take the hit. They'd do the penance and everything afterwards for saving the girl from drowning. Another my lesser case that I did is it's against the rules for a monk to practice medicine, like give medicine to lay people. Like to your own parents or to another monk, it's okay, but to be like dispensing medicines and that sort of thing to lay people who come to see you is against the rules. But I had this one time I was living way out in the sticks, and this old man came and told me that his daughter had malaria, and it was like falciparum malaria, the worst kind of malaria, like the deadliest kind, that she had it for some god awful amount of time. I can't remember if it was 6 weeks or 6 months. And I had some state of the art meditation, uh, malaria medication. So I just gave him enough pills to cure her, and she got better. So I mean, I broke a rule. It was a minor offense, but I figured it was better than let some nice lady die. So yeah, I mean, some monks are just dogmatically attached to the precepts, and this silabata paramasa, it's called in Pali, is just clinging to morality and observances. And the observances, they don't even have any real morality involved. It's just stuff, having the right color of robes on, or not eating at the wrong time. I mean, it's not even really doesn't have anything inherently moral about it. It's just an observance. It's just like a tradition. And some monks just adhere to those dogmatically. Um, and I mean, to some degree, it's not entirely blameworthy if you're just trying to be as strict as you can. Um, and one reason why they have those rules is just for a monk not to have like this ego thing going on where he gets to decide what he's going to do or not do when you got it all laid out. This is what you're allowed to do, and this is what you're not allowed to do, and yeah, it just makes life a lot simpler. Maybe makes it easier to become enlightened, unless you're just clinging to these rules and then just like despising all the people around you who aren't following the rules correctly. I went through that when I was a young monk. Just monks, all these monks handling money and stuff. It's like you just want to just slap them one. But I mean, that's not good either. That's bad karma too. So you just have to put up with it, or just mind your own business. Or if you can admonish another person with metta in your heart, then that's good. But if you can't manage the metta, then you're better off not even trying to admonish them. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from BPAT427. And BPAT427 says, would a cashier at a gas station that sells beer be guilty of wrong livelihood? How about someone who works in a machine shop that subcontracts to firearm manufacturers? I suppose the latter example could also apply to a sheet metal factory that supplies arms manufacturers with sheet metal. Okay, well, the first part is easy. Would a cashier at a gas station that sells beer be guilty of wrong livelihood? Yes, because right livelihood, one of the stipulations of that is no selling drugs or intoxicants. So, like even the cashier at the grocery store who's selling beer or like a can of Raid, bug spray, it's not right livelihood. And even in Burma, sometimes there'd be like the nice devout Burmese family that would invite me to their tea shop to like bless the tea shop, and then they're selling beer there just because that's what everyone does. Those tea shops have to have beer as an option, or people will just go somewhere else, and it's wrong livelihood. Um, Selling poison, selling animals for slaughter, selling slaves, all of that is wrong livelihood, and also selling weapons. So how about someone who works in a machine shop that subcontracts to firearms manufacturers? So long as he's not selling weapons, if he's just making like a trigger guard or something, or just selling metal that will get turned into weapons, um, it would depend on his own mental states to some degree. Technically, he wouldn't be selling weapons, and if he's just making it, he's not even selling it. So, yeah, I don't think there's any rule against making like parts to a weapon. I mean, if you wanted to like extend the stipulations of the rule to say, well, that's not proper either. Well, that's your call. But yeah, someone who works in a machine shop that subcontracts to firearms manufacturers, so long as he's not literally selling weapons, then it's not wrong livelihood. At least that's my take on it. But again, it's there's all these shades of gray, and like personally, I'm not entirely opposed to the existence of weapons for self-defense. But then again, I'm kind of a heretic. So we'll just move on to the next question. This is from Aurelian. And Aurelian, he watched a recent video that I uploaded, which is actually an old video that I made as a monk, where I'm talking to a Burmese Buddhist society, and I'm trying to explain to them, for example, why it is that most Western monks don't take Abhidhamma seriously. So I'm kind of pointing out that Asian monks are less likely to be strict in their practice than Western monks, and explaining why that is and so forth. So anyway, Aurelian saw that, and he says, how was your experience navigating the internal politics of the Burmese temple community in the USA? You seem to apologetically drop some truth bombs on your audience in temple talks. How receptive were the audience, and did you ever get any pushback for your nonconformist ways? Um, Sometimes people would try to admonish me a little bit. but it wasn't because of the talks I gave in public, I'm pretty sure, unless they just didn't understand what I was saying. If I try and give a talk in Burmese, sometimes, there'd be like some mistake made in like my lack of mastery of the Burmese language or something. So people would come up to me afterward and talk to me about that. And then I try to explain to them, no, that's not really what I meant. I just maybe accidentally said that or something. But usually I get some pushback from monks. Like, I mean, I didn't make it any secret that I didn't consider Abhidhamma to be like genuine teachings of Buddha. So then I have monks, try and tell me, you can get bad karma for heresy and this kind of a thing, or even, you get like even not wanting to bow down to statues. I'd have monks try to admonish me about that. I remember one time, um, I was living at this forest monastery, and this school monk came, from town, and he just announced to me that he wanted to teach me the rules of monastic discipline. And I probably knew the rules of monastic discipline better than anybody else at the monastery at the time. He just assumed because I'm a foreigner, I didn't know anything, I think. And so I just to give him a little taste of what he would be up against, teaching me the rules of monastic discipline, I'd say, well, I do not consider the commentaries to be 100% authoritative. And he just got this grin on his face, like, oh, these foreigners. And he just said, that's not possible. So, I mean, that's the kind of attitude you get from a lot of monks. But lay people, especially Asian lay people, tend to be very humble and um, uh, what is it? They defer to monks. So if they say something that, if I say something that they don't believe or anything, they might talk to other people about it, but they're not gonna like get on my case about it. So most of the pushback I got for being a nonconformist was from other monks, and um, I would push back at the pushback, and then they'd back off. So the next question, also from Aurelian. Would you ever consider robing up again and re-entering monastic life? Perhaps if a politically incorrect temple community developed. I know you have moved on to householder life, but have you made a mental switch and moved on entirely for the rest of this lifetime? I have no intention of becoming a monk again. I got as far as I could with it. Um, I mean, theoretically, in retrospect, or whatever, you could say, well, if I tried this or that, but no, I'm done being a monk for this life. Um, See, here's the last part of this question, though, is have you made a mental switch and moved on entirely for the rest of this lifetime? Well, I mean, I haven't entirely switched over. I was a monk for so long. I was a monk for 30 years, more than half my life. Um, that, I mean, still, I'm more in monk mode sometimes than is good for a householder. Um, So I think I'm always going to be sort of like in a limbo, this sort of intermediate. Because I mean, I didn't really identify as a monk a lot of the time. I mean, I didn't really identify like I'm this bhikkhu. Like I think it was like probably 10 years after I became a monk that finally in my dreams I was a monk more than half the time. And then sometimes there'd be like these weird sort of ambiguous dreams where I'm just hanging out with my old buddies and they want to go to McDonald's or something. And I'd say, wait, I gotta wrap up in the road properly before we can go, that kind of a thing. So, um, yeah, I mean, I have no intention of uh, wearing monk's robes again, other than just show people how it's done, like I did in a recent video. But yeah, I haven't made a complete switch back to layperson, and I don't know if I ever will. So I'll just move on to Aurelian's next and last question here. What would be the proper way for a layperson to make penance for breaking the precepts? For example, I consciously decide to enjoy some whiskey. Now what? Retake precepts, confession, resolve to go and sin no more? Well, the standard Burmese way of doing it is you go to a monk or like a teacher, tell them what you did, and then take the precepts over again. That would be, so it'd be like you confess and then retake the precept. That's the standard traditional way of dealing with it. So Yeah, I mean, if you want to make some resolve or something to try and do better in future, that would be good too. But if I mean, if you don't have someone to confess to, like you don't have a monk, you can just tell anybody that you think might have the proper frame of mind to, say something other than so, and then just retake the precept and resolve to try and do better in future, if in fact that is your intention. I mean, if it's not really your intention, you're just going to keep drinking whiskey from time to time, then there's not much point in like making any kind of resolve. I mean, you can take the precept and keep it for a week. Now, some people do that. I mean, a lot of Burmese people, they think you just get merit just for taking the precepts, even if you have no intention of keeping them. Like I remember one time I was living out in a cave in the woods. This group of people came, including this teenage girl. They took 8 precepts, which includes the no adornments part. And then as they're leaving, I saw her just see a flower on the ground, just bend down, pick it up, and stick it in her hair. Just 5 minutes after taking the precepts. So that happens. They just think that they're going to get merit just from taking the precepts. And I've tried to explain it to them. It's like, you get more merit for keeping precepts without taking them than taking precepts without keeping them. It's sort of like one time I was way out in the sticks. I was trying to teach a sermon to these Burmese hillbillies, and it was a story out of the New Testament of the Bible. Where you got a father has 2 sons, and he tells his sons, go out and work in the fields today. And the first son says, no, I don't want to. I'm just going to stay here. But then later, he changes his mind and goes out and does what his father told him to. Whereas the second son says, yes, father, I'll do it. And then he doesn't even bother. He's just talking bullshit. And I'm saying, which son is better? The one who, told his father he'd do it and then didn't, or the one who told his father he didn't want to and then he wound up doing what his father told him to. And it was just too abstract. They'd never heard anything like it before, so they had no idea. But obviously, the first son, in the Bible, the New Testament itself, it points out that the first son is the better son, the one who says, I won't do it, and then he winds up doing what his father told him to. And it's kind of like keeping precepts. I mean, obviously, you're better off not even bothering to take 5 precepts formally and then just keeping them just spontaneously out of the goodness of your heart or whatever, than taking the precepts and just knowing full well that you're not even going to keep them. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Hey It's Tig. And Hey It's Tig says, in your article titled Hysteria and the Holy Life, you wrote about your previous habit of writing aggressively confrontational letters to people. What communication medium did you use to further this goal? Was it email, postal, or something else? Well, this was back in the 1990s, and I was living in Burma most of the time. So there was no email. I mean, there was no something else. It was just writing letters on paper and putting them in an envelope and putting a stamp on the envelope and the address and everything, and then launching it into the unknown, not knowing if it was ever going to reach its destination, because the government would be like intercepting my mail a lot of the time. So yeah, it was entirely writing on paper the way Fred Flintstone used to do it. Okay, so I'll just move on to the next question. That was kind of a surprisingly easy question. Next question is from B-Don. And B-Don says, I have a question about judgment and metta. I'm a very judgmental and easily disgusted person with regards to others. For example, fat people, emotionally unstable women, effeminate men initially give me a strong visceral feeling of repulse and contempt. As I've been practicing, I can catch myself noting the initial judgment, and then I can be understanding of different people's experiences and circumstances. I've struggled with this and have felt guilty about being a bad person. However, I feel the judgment isn't unwholesome or uncritical or hypocritical. I feel the judgment isn't unwholesome or hypocritical. I'm only judgmental because I hold myself to those standards and see them as duties and non-negotiable for strong, healthy communities. I'm aware that to reach higher spiritual truths and insights, then a more loving and accepting attitude should be cultivated. My problem is I feel this is just how I'm wired, and may not change, nor do I want to lower my standards for myself or others. Do you have any wisdom or advice for developing a less judgmental attitude, or how I can be comfortable with my attitude should it not be able to change? Well, that's a good question, and this has applied to me also. I used to be very judgmental, not nearly so much as I used to be, but yeah, some of the same kinds of people, and also just sloppy monks. I was very judgmental of just lax, sloppy monks that weren't even trying. Um, and I mean, one thing I can play devil's advocate here a little bit and point out that this attitude of just sort of like being irritable, having aversion, according to the Visuddhimagga, for what that's worth, um, such a disposition actually makes it easier to become enlightened because you kind of are disgusted with the world. You're disgusted with samsara, and that sort of like helps you to get out of samsara. But it's not really a good justification for atimaññā, or just um, having a low opinion of other people. You know, atimaññā is a Pali term which literally means it's like contempt, contemptuousness. You know, I'm just having a low opinion of others. And I think the main thing that has helped me to be less judgmental of people is having been a monk for so long, trying to be a saint and just failing to be a saint. Just you realize how hard it is to change your own programming. Usually it takes some kind of breakdown, some kind of crisis where it's just not working anymore. And then you sort of like, you have the breakdown, and then you can like restructure your personality to some degree, especially if you've got a wise, compassionate teacher who's helping you. Um, but, you know, I tried so hard. Like, I used to have a very low opinion of really overweight people. It's like, you know, how can they do this to themselves? You know, there's so much stuff that they can't even do. You know, and then um, being a monk, I mean, that was not my issue, but I had my own issues, and it was just as hard to overcome them. And then you start having a more compassion for others when you're striving to live up to this ideal that you yourself can't live up to. Then, you know, why should you insist that others do the same? Kind of, it's that kind of attitude. And I think that more than anything, just kind of the humility that comes from trying to turn yourself into a saint or a sage, something that you're not, you know, trying to become somebody different. And you find out that, I mean, you are what you are. I mean, to a really profound degree, is that you just can't help it. Schopenhauer wrote a lot about this kind of thing. Unfortunately, I don't have any quotes handy, but yeah, for me, that's really what helped me the most was, you know, trying to live up to my own ideals, and then not entirely, but to some degree failing, and then realizing just you know, as someone who's not even like dedicating their life to being a saint, you know, somebody who's not even a meditator, who's maybe has not a whole lot of self-awareness going on. I mean, what hope do they have? You know, it makes you have a lot more compassion, you know, like seeing little kids in some village, and chances are they're just going to be subsistence farmers, you know, poverty stricken subsistence farmers, not much education, not much intelligence maybe. And it's like, you know, I can bless them, and, you know, may you live long and be happy and all that. But um, most people, they're just not up for it. So, I mean, that's the best advice I can give you. I mean, aside from what I said before of just having that kind of aversive, or that kind of mentality when applied to Dhamma, it can help you to become enlightened just because you have like more aversion, or more dissatisfaction or disillusionment with regard to samsara in general. But yeah, just mindfulness also. I mean, when it arises, Bidon here says he already does that. He watches the judgment arise. But yeah, but definitely for me, it's just trying hard to change myself and realizing just how hard that is causes me to have a lot more of an accepting attitude towards other people and their quirks. I mean, some quirks are more acceptable than others. I mean, like someone who's like a pedophile, they're just, they're after little kids. Then they can say that's they can't help it. But if they can't help it and they're doing something potentially very harmful, then yeah, they should just get locked up. So next question is from Iron Age Sophist. An Iron Age Sophist says, according to Buddhist thought, is it selfish to do good deeds with the motive of making good karma for ourselves? To some degree. There's little twinges of it. It depends on the mental states. You want to do good karma. I mean, why do you want to do good karma? Just because it's your duty to do good karma? That would be better than I want good karma because I want, the mansion in heaven with 500 celestial nymphs. You know, so I mean, if you're doing good karma just because you feel like you ought to do good karma, it just seems like the good thing to do. It's like your sacred duty. Then yeah, then it'd be less selfish than wanting good karma so that good things can happen to you. But there's always going to be a certain amount of selfishness involved. It's just you can make it milder or more severe. So let's see if I've answered. It's like I've answered this question so quickly. It's almost scaring me here. According to Buddhist thought, is it selfish to do good deeds with the motive of making good karma for ourselves? Not necessarily, but I mean, Buddhist ethics are so finely tuned that damn near anything you do is going to have some selfishness involved. So I'm moving on to the next question here from Thur. And Thur says, where do you come down on whether smoking tobacco violates the fifth precept? I've seen pictures of monks in Southeast Asia smoking cigarettes. Did you see this during your time as a monk? Even if they don't technically violate the precept, cigarettes are pretty nasty and addictive. I myself have never and would never smoke them, but I have considered smoking a pipe. Well, I think one of the before I get to that part, I will say that if tobacco existed in the Ganges Valley during the time of the Buddha, almost certainly he would have made a rule against it. Or the senior monks who followed him, when Munya was being compiled and edited and turned into the systematic system of monastic discipline, yeah, almost certainly tobacco would be against the rules because literally it is an addictive drug. If desire is the cause of all suffering, you don't want to be cultivating a habit that increases desire, obviously. But as I was going to say a little earlier here, the problem, especially in Thailand, is that Ajahn Mun was a chain smoker, allegedly. And Ajahn Mun was considered to be an arahant. So if an arahant does it, it must be okay. He also ate cheese in the afternoon. And if an arahant can eat cheese in the afternoon, then it must be okay. And so you're not going to get anywhere with that. I remember hearing that during the Burmese Sixth Council back in the 1950s, that a Western Buddhist named Christmas Humphreys, he brought up for consideration at this council, should smoking tobacco be considered moral or immoral? And should it be allowable or not allowable to a good Buddhist? And it was just too controversial. I mean, the monks who run these great councils tend to be very conservative, very traditionalist. They don't want to deal with anything that they haven't already dealt with 100 times at least, and so they just shelved it. They didn't even want to deal with it. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious that from a dharmic point of view, smoking any or taking any addictive drug that gets you addicted. I mean, having a beer is not the same as being an alcoholic. So, I mean, like, I don't know, trying a cigarette to see what it's like is not going to be the same as being addicted to nicotine. But the more you do it, the more likely it is that you will get addicted. So you're better off keeping it to a minimum, to say the least. And now we got a question from this guy is a wise guy. I'm just letting you know here. His name is Arga Kirti Shiksham Samaja. Arga Kirti Shiksha Samaja, also known by other names, including Trumptonshire Gahapati. Anyway, he says, according to Buddhist thought, is there a distinction between kusala or wholesome behavior that generates merit leading to, for example, pleasant rebirths, versus behavior that is efficacious at moving toward bodhi? For instance, would stopping meditation to jump in a river to rescue a drowning person be an example of the former, while impassively continuing to meditate would be the latter? Well, I mean, there is a lot of overlap that just doing good deeds, it creates good karma, which then causes smoother sailing in your future so that your life and your mind become more calm and clearer. So yeah, there's not a clear cut distinction between earning merit and going for enlightenment, although ultimately if you're getting into the higher stages of practice, then a monk especially is encouraged to leave merit and demerit behind. That merit and demerit are both karma, and they're both, you know, they're both samsaric. They keep you in samsara. So a monk, if he's going to become enlightened, has to leave behind good and evil. He has to leave behind merit and demerit, good and bad karma. So, yeah, I mean, in the earlier stages, then doing good deeds that can get you into heaven, or at least getting you into a clearer ground for practice, you know, with fewer bad things happening to you that are going to distract you and derail your practice and so forth. But then once you get, you know, into the higher levels of it, then you have to start leaving all that merit stuff behind. So I hope I answered that question. And now we've got a question from a person with an equally difficult name. Siovaksh and Sipadzidana. And Siovaksh and Sipadzidana says, why do Buddhist monks change their name upon ordination? It doesn't seem like names were changed of monks in the times of the Buddha. That's kind of an interesting question. Um, when a monk is ordained, he receives a Pali name. And so I received the name Paññābāsa when I became a monk. I didn't get to pick it myself. My preceptor picked the name. And one reason for that is that your name has to be used in the ordination ceremony, which is all in Pali. So you have to have a Pali or at least a Paliized name so that the declension of nouns and so forth, the declension of the name and stuff fits Pali grammar so that you can do it in the ceremony and the ceremony will be valid with correct grammar and all that. But to some degree, I mean, it is true that in ancient India, nobody changed their names. That they had the same name as after they became a monk as before. And I mean, it's just now a tradition that you receive a formal Pali name as a monk. So that I actually knew a Burmese man who had a Pali name. His name was Uthihan, which is the U is just like the honorific before the name. Thihan was just the Burmese pronunciation of the Pali word Siha, which means lion. Yeah, so he already had a Pali name, and still they gave him a different Pali name, also starting with S. So he became Sobida or something like that. So even though he already had a Pali name, they just gave him a different one instead. So I think that to that extent, it's just tradition that you get a Pali name now. All right, so Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana, whose name is getting slowly easier to pronounce, asks the next question here, which is, it says in suttas, the Buddha attains enlightenment and the higher knowledges in the fourth jhana, but the commentaries say that you can't get insight in jhanas because you are too concentrated. Can you explain this contradiction and how the Buddha could achieve enlightenment while in jhana? Well, according to Orthodox tradition, you don't get insight, including liberating insight, while you're in jhana. It's just that as soon as you come out of jhana, the insight can arise just through like reviewing the experience or whatever. And like my favorite example of that which I've told several times, is in the uh, Lesser Discourse on Voidness in the Majjhima Nikaya, about a monk who cultivates gradually more and more vacuous, like more empty mental states until he gets to the signless concentration of mind, the animeta chitta samadhi. Is that right? Yeah, animeta chitta samadhi, which is higher than fourth jhana, supposedly. That's the implication. And he gets to that level, and then it's only when he comes out of it that he realizes that that was the highest level of attainable. And that's still not it. It still had a beginning and an end. It's still just a conditioned samsaric state. And then that's when the insight arises, and that's when he becomes enlightened. And that's the way it's supposed to work, is when you're in jhana, you're just in this state of bliss. You know, it's temporary or temporary liberation, but it's not permanent liberation. But then when you come out of that, insights can arise, like including liberating insight. And so the jhana can like trigger the liberating insight, but the liberating insight doesn't occur while the meditator is in jhana. So I think that answers that question. So I'll just move on to the next one, also by C.O. Vaksha and Sipad Zidana. In another video, you say that Goenka body scanning technique can probably only get you to intermediate level. What techniques of meditation can be done at beginner, intermediate, and advanced stages as we develop along the path? Well, any meditation technique that has you thinking and labeling, doing a lot of busy work, which may be necessary for a beginner because the beginner's mind has this restless, hyperactive mind that has to be set to work and just kept out of trouble. You know, it has to be disciplined, and then gradually the mind becomes calmer and quieter, and then you can get rid of a lot of this busy work. So, you know, any kind of technique where you're still thinking, you know, when you're doing breathing meditation, you're just like breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. You're still thinking, and it's like an anchor in samsara. So above that level is you're still perceiving, you're still focusing on things and noting them silently, even though you're not labeling them. Still, I mean, you're like focusing your attention on one thing to the exclusion of everything else. You know, you're distinguishing between figure and ground. You know, you're still essentially in a samsaric mental state. So that would be sort of intermediate. Like elementary would be you're still like thinking and labeling. The state above that is you're not thinking in symbolic thoughts anymore, but still you're perceiving and focusing, and you know, you've got like a primary object and so forth. But then like when you get to the advanced stage, it just becomes practically effortless, where I mean your mind is just wide open. You know, it's not concentrating on one thing to the exclusion of everything else. And I mean, people that say that jhana is a state of like fourth jhana is just like laser pinpoint on something. I think they might be confusing that with more of a hypnotic state, because I mean, you're not more conscious. I mean, maybe you got the same amount of consciousness as before, but it's narrowed down into this laser beam. Whereas, I mean, it seems to me that if you're going to get closer to enlightenment, your mind's going to be opening out instead of closing up. And so you're going to be more and more aware of the full field of consciousness without narrowing it down to just focusing on this or just focusing on that. And then when you get into those kind of stages, these expansive, just wide open, quiet stages, I think it would be a more advanced than like in the Goenka system where you're like looking for some sensation in some quadrant of your body. Then as soon as you feel it, you note it, and then you move on to the next. And it's like you're scanning your body. It's still a fair amount of busy work, and it's essentially samsaric what you're doing. It's a more higher level, more subtle level of samsara than the guy riding the bus, looking out the window, or eating his lunch or whatever. But still, you're trying to quiet the mind, and then when it becomes like very quiet, like no moving parts, and you're still conscious. I mean, you're not like in a coma or anything. You might be more conscious than before. You're not like becoming a hibernating squirrel or anything like that. Then you're getting into advanced states. You're getting into mystical states where you're experiencing reality directly and not through the intermediate filter of a perceiving mentality. So, what techniques of meditation can be done at beginner, intermediate, and advanced stages? Well, like beginner and intermediate, you can still be doing anapana until you get to the point where it's just so subtle that your mind just isn't really like focused, laser focused on this one phenomenon anymore. Then you just move on to some kind of jhanic state, I suppose. But when you're a beginner and your mind is busy, you have to keep your mind occupied. Otherwise, it'll just get bored and distracted and drift off. You don't have enough busy work for it to do. Then some of your excess mental energy is just going to like go off in its own direction. But on the other hand, if your concentration is good, giving it all this busy work to do is just counterproductive. You're not gonna get into any subtle states that way. So I guess I should just move on to the next question. Also by the same guy. And this is the second to last question, by the way. And he says, other than the experience of Nibbana itself and the extermination of the poisons, what do you think an arahant gains? For example, the commentaries claim arahants have complete mastery of the pathways of the mind, see past lives, psychic powers, etc. Well, not all arahants even have psychic powers or see their past lives. They're what are called dry visioned arahants that didn't attain the higher jhanas. They just did like insight meditation and became enlightened that way, and then they don't have the psychic powers. So really, I think it's not what an arhat gains, it's what he loses. He doesn't necessarily gain anything. He's just losing all the delusion, all the fake false stuff, all the stuff that he thought was real or good or beautiful or whatever before. That all falls away, and the absolute, the highest truth, which is always there, it's still there, except now it's he's conscious of it, he's aware of it. So maybe what the arhat mainly gains is just an awareness of the highest truth that stays with him, although it was always there, but there's all this extra stuff that got in the way. So it's more accurate, I think, to say that an arhat just loses stuff and doesn't gain anything necessarily. And so I'll just move on to the very last question, also by C.O. Vaksh and Sipad Zidana. And this question is, what do you think about the psychic powers claimed to be attained in the ancient texts? Ajahn Mun is the last person many lay people seem to agree had mind-reading powers, but do you think these things even exist? Well, there are still monks that are considered to have mind-reading powers. I met Shui Umen Seattle long ago, and he supposedly, one of his disciples was telling me that he had his mind read. There's a monk in Thailand still, or at least 20 years ago. I had a German monk tell me, if you have any doubts, you go meet this monk, and he'll tell you what you're thinking. And of course, I've read lots of stories about like Neem Karoli Baba, who was a Hindu, and yeah, he just had astonishing psychic powers. It was just some of the stories. I mean, some of the stories are probably unlikely to be true, but still, I mean, Ram Dass is, I consider him to be a fairly honest person. He's brutally honest with regard to himself. And he had all kinds of weird stuff happen with Maharaji or Neem Karoli Baba. And I mean, for that matter, just parapsychology has pretty much demonstrated the existence of at least a small amount of psychic powers, like the ability to guess cards at consistently above the level of random chance. It might just be like 1% above random chance, but still, when it's consistent and repeated, that indicates that everybody, or virtually everybody has like this latent capacity for that sort of thing. So Ajahn Mun, I'm not so sure about um, Ajahn Mun being the last. Well, many lay people seem to agree he had mind reading powers, but I mean, there's lots of people that have psychic powers, including um, just parapsychology subjects. Like I was reading about a parapsychology book. It mentioned Helmut Schmidt, and I still wonder whatever happened to Helmut Schmidt. He was a research engineer for Boeing Laboratories. This was several decades ago, and they were having a slow a slow time where there wasn't much research that was being done. So he asked permission to study the effects of consciousness on mechanical systems, and they gave him the green light. And he invented some really elegant. I mean, I don't know how you could debunk this stuff, where he had like a random number generator based on a Geiger counter and just this counter 1 2 1 2. So you just get this random number of ones and twos or zeros and ones or whatever, and then he could he could take that and transform it into an audio thing where it's like the ones would be a click in this ear and the twos would be a click in the other ear. And then he'd sit someone down with the headphones and just tell them, try to make more clicks in the left ear this time. And people consistently, I mean, he could do thousands of tests. They didn't take very long. And consistently, even though he's altering sometimes right ear, sometimes left ear thing, um, still is above random chance. And you know, it's sort of like the ability of aspirin to prevent heart attacks. They were doing like a study on that back in the 80s, I think, where they finally had to just break off the study because they considered it to be um, like unethical to keep running the study and depriving the control group of the aspirin that obviously was conducive to keeping them from having heart attacks. And the amount of above above random that these people were doing with the clicks, it was about the same percentage. So I mean, it was for aspirin preventing heart attacks. I mean, that was conclusive evidence enough that they just called off the study so that it was unethical to continue and deprive the control group of the aspirin. And but the thing is that so many scientists are just like materialistic, like scientific materialists, that they just cannot bring themselves to believe that psychic powers are even possible. But I consider them to be possible. So, how do I think these things even exist? Well, mind is number one. Like the first verse of the Dhammapada, the mind is it's the forerunner of all things, and I'm not really a materialist. So, I think one of the reasons why we don't have these powers is just that we're so locked into materialism now. We just don't we can't believe, we don't have the faith, which of course reminds us of Jesus of Nazareth, who supposedly had all these powers where he was walking on water and healing blind people and lame people and so forth. And I think there's a good chance that he could do that stuff, and I don't think he was the only one. Exactly how um, the world is not bound by materialistic laws invented by scientists. And the one book that I read that explains this stuff the best, I think, is The Trickster and the Paranormal by George P. Hansen, who says that this kind of stuff will never really be proven because it's like leaking through the cracks between the rules and the laws that we consider governs reality. That once you get to a certain level, I mean, like if you an ordinary worldling, they might just have like a weird mind that has a talent for this sort of thing. But you get up into like advanced sage level, and yeah, they can start controlling it, or at least they're way better at doing it. So I would just advise you to read *The Trickster and the Paranormal* by George P. Hansen, who was a parapsychologist, to get a good idea of how it works. I've talked about it lots of times, and this video is already over 2 hours, so I think I better call it good. So, yeah, I guess we're done. And if you have any questions, you are very welcome to ask them. And anything that you think that I would be likely to answer, especially questions about Buddhism or spirituality or philosophy, Eastern religions, Burma, me personally, living in caves, that kind of thing. Feel free to ask in the comments below. If you have access to my subscribe star, you can ask there. If you have access to my Discord server, you can ask there. And check out the URL links below. And give this video a like if you please. And be happy.